Welcome to the second episode of our series, Anticipating and Preparing for Fusion Energy. In this, the second episode, we'll be interviewing Dr. Axel Meisen for a second time. In the first episode, we explored just what is fusion and what might we anticipate in terms of its impacts. In this episode, we're exploring the pathway to fusion, how to get ready, but also probing its environmental implications. So welcome, Axel. For
Thank
our
you.
new viewers, please let's start out with a little bit of your background, how it is that you became interested in fusion for energy, the research, and the anticipated social and economic impacts.
Thank you for the opportunity, Perry, and thank you for everybody attending here today. So I became interested in fusion energy in the early parts of this century when I held the chair in foresight at the Alberta Research Council, as it was called at that time. And I was charged with the responsibility to look at opportunities, primarily for Alberta, that were long-term opportunities. And energy clearly surfaced very early in that regard. But it wasn't just the known forms of energy from hydrocarbons. Solar and geothermal energy came to the forefront as well. But then there was this unusual type of energy, which is now referred to as fusion energy. And in the first instance, I had to distinguish it from fission energy. That didn't take too long to figure out. And I had an opportunity to see the work that was leading towards fusion energy at the National Ignition Facility in California. A small group of us went there, and we recognized the long-term enormous potential that fusion energy could provide. At that time, we weren't that much focused on greenhouse gas emissions, although that started to become part of the conversation. And of course, fusion energy, which is the result of the fusing of light in nuclei, deuterium and tritium are the typical ones that we're looking at, is not accompanied by greenhouse gas emissions of any significance. It is not accompanied by high levels of radioactivity. It has low risk from an explosive runaway nuclear reaction perspective. In fact, it has really no risk with respect to a runaway nuclear meltdown. So these were all very attractive, even though they were far out. And I, of course, pointed out, and it was pointed out to me, and we also started the first episode of this interview with the fact that fusion is the energy that's produced in the sun and in the stars. So it's a natural phenomenon. It's extremely powerful. And the challenge is to harness it on Earth for the benefits of humankind. And that takes us to today.
Well, thank you. I think optimism is high. We're certainly not talking as we once did. It's always 50 years into the future. Capital is flowing, but even though our earlier episode was only a few weeks ago, progress continues. Is there anything new to report by any of the many research labs and now corporations engaged in the race to achieve a sustained fusion reaction?
Well, there have been reports out of Japan and also out of China of the sustaining of plasmas for very significant periods of time. And sustaining plasmas under conditions where fusion can occur is a prerequisite for fusion to occur. So that's very exciting. And there's hardly a week that goes by when some major advance is not reported. So I feel very optimistic from that perspective that we're really making good progress scientifically. My great regret is so far, and this will come out in this conversation, that Canada is not, as of yet, a major participant, even though we have individuals who have expertise and knowledge and approaches who could make enormous contributions. And my hope and my dedication is to enable precisely that.
Even though of late there seems to be some fading interest in a number of policies that have shaped Canada's activities over the last few years, what roles do you see fusion energy playing in helping Canada meet its climate goals and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, say by 2050 and beyond, as seems to be our focus?
Yeah, so I don't think that fusion energy production will be a significant contributor either in Canada or worldwide to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But in the second half of the century, that will become prominent. Because in order to make an impact, you have to have a large number of plants that generate electricity. And if a good sized plant produces between 1 and 3 gigawatts of electricity, uh, for example, that's large for any one plant. But in aggregate, and what the world needs, this is a tiny fraction. So we will need hundreds, ultimately thousands of plants to produce energy from fusion, just as we currently have hundreds, indeed thousands of plants that produce electricity from natural gas or from hydropower. So it will shift over to fusion in the years to come. And we have to work on making that happen. We can't just wait until the second half of the century and then assume that fusion energy will be available. It takes hard, but really very rewarding work to make it happen.
But
And
it's not
that's what we're engaged.
but it's not an unrealistic expectation that it should be recognized as having potential impact on climate.
It will have a big impact on climate, but it is cumulative. I mean, even if you look at the impact of solar energy today, it's still only less than 20% in most countries. Globally, it's about 15% of energy production in total. Now, 15% is a lot more than nothing, but we've come from nothing over the last 20 years with respect to solar, and that will likely increase.
So is the focus for the moment on the last half of the century and the beginning of the deployment of fusion energy on a large scale? Are there environmental and safety risks that should be aware? Any associated with fusion energy production on the large scale?
Yes, there are some safety risks, and we have to identify and face those squarely. So, what are they? They are not explosions or they are not radioactive meltdowns or runaways, mainly because the plasmas are extremely difficult to maintain, to keep on going. But there are some risks because you deal typically with tritium as being one of the fuels. Now, there are other processes that you can use that do not use tritium, but tritium is the favored one. And tritium is a radioactive material. It has a half-life of about 12 years, so it decays fairly rapidly. But it does constitute a health hazard if tritium is incorporated into water, inhaled, for example, it will do damage. So tritium has to be managed. And we know how to manage tritium very well in the case of Canada because it's a byproduct from the CANDU nuclear fission process. And we have handled and we've developed expertise for tritium since the beginning of CANDUs in the 1950s. So that it's a tritium in its radioactivity is one aspect that one has to look at. The other aspect is because the fusion reactions create neutrons, these neutrons have so much energy that they can make certain other materials radioactive. For example, iron can become radioactive, tungsten can become radioactive, and you end then up with materials, and iron and tungsten would typically be used as structural materials in a fusion plant that have to be managed. But the half-lives of the chemicals that I mentioned are short. They run into from a few years to a few decades. So if you store those materials for 100 years, they would lose their radioactivity, which is different from the byproducts that are produced in most fission reactors, some of which have half-lives that run into thousands of years. And therefore, you need these geological storage places that have to be kept and managed over the millennia, not just over several years. So I think those are dangers that have to be looked at, and that's precisely what is being done by the scientists, by the regulators who have become engaged in this.
So when we talk about fusion and its extraordinary implications, I mean, we're looking at a source that can be fueled for billions of years, that can be located within population centers because it's lower risk. Those that study the evolution of energy often note that wood for energy hasn't disappeared, coal for energy hasn't disappeared. We have now hydro, solar, and energy that aren't disappearing. Those that really get excited about fusion, seeing it displacing all this as opposed to complementing, and yet the energy demands of the globe have continued to rise. Do you see it as as displacing these other sources of energy or complementary?
I think in many cases they are complementary, but at times they do displace. And for example, the amount of coal that's used today to generate electricity is significantly below what it used to be in North America. Like Ontario used to, and Alberta used to burn large amounts of coal to generate electricity. That essentially has stopped, been replaced by natural gas as a source of energy. And I think we will likely see the displacement of natural gas by fusion energy in the longer term, which then means, of course, what are we doing with the natural gas that we have? Just like we can ask the question, what do we do with the coal that we currently have? Fortunately, natural gas is somewhat more versatile than coal. I mean, there's coal that you can use for energy purposes and coal that you can use for metallurgical purposes. And the demand for coal for metallurgical purposes hasn't really changed. But there is a connection even there to fusion. If you think about production of steel, which involves coking type of coal, there's a lot of work going on using electricity to convert iron ore into iron. And that electricity can, in principle, come from fusion energy. So you may very well see in the longer term the displacement of coking coal, metallurgical coal by fusion energy as well. And it opens up new opportunities for the steel industry, to use that as an example.
Well, there are many that talk about electrification being a
Yes,
movement in itself. And now with artificial intelligence and the demands made by data centers, which is a whole nother revolution in itself, it's conceivable that fusion is arriving at just the right time, which takes us into the next phase of this discussion, which is marketing.
right.
When I was first exposed to fusion, it looked to me like the engineers and the scientists in academia were pushing fusion. But we know full well if we're ever going to make a full dent or a dent into its commercialization, we need to we need to be able to portray fusion in such a way that there is a demand, a pull for it. So what misconceptions about fusion energy do we encounter most frequently that may be restraining the adoption of fusion or the excitement of the general public?
Well, I think there are several. One of them is this notion that fusion is always a long time away. I think that assumption or preconception is changing, and it is much greater proximity now than it used to be. But that doesn't mean it is available next year. Just as we said at the introduction of this conversation, it will take several decades until fusion will become widely available. But let's go beyond that aspect. Fusion energy production is really difficult to do. And anything that's difficult to do is normally capital intensive. And in many cases, it's uncertain of how to do this. Today, we have three principal ways of fusing light isotopes. Some people would argue there's probably a dozen, but there are three principal ways, the inertial confinement, the magnetic confinement, and the magnetic target approach. And we talked about that the last time. Each one of these is complex with respect to the fusion reactor itself, because you have to get to these extreme conditions of temperatures and pressures and times. But because the fusion is not complete in the reactor, it's only partial, you have to recycle your materials. And so there is this issue of how do you do the recycling? And that's a difficult technical problem. And what you get from a fusion reactor is essentially thermal energy and neutrons. And so you have to convert that thermal energy also into electricity, which is typically the desired product from a fusion plant. Although there are applications that utilize just the high temperatures from a fusion plant. So it's complex to do that, and there are many engineering problems that remain to be solved. I mentioned early on the induced radioactivity into structural materials. You can't let that build up, so you have to change these materials out. So that's an important problem. You have to manage the tritium. When it is being recycled, you have to have enough storage material, and you have to produce the tritium inside the plant by exposing the neutrons to lithium isotopes. So that's a difficult task to do. And we don't have good answers to some of these things. And we certainly don't have good answers to the question of how will a plant like this operate over an extended period of time. When you make a multi-billion-dollar investment in a plant, it's meant to run for a good number of years, taking into account maintenance. You don't want it to fail. So we don't have enough knowledge about that. So that's what makes people rightfully cautious and skeptical, and we have to recognize that. But the only way to deal with that is to work at it.
So most of these issues are issues that an engineer would be familiar with, a physics teacher perhaps, and unlikely to be of particular concern to the general public, that may not be that, quote, sophisticated. Just as with the internal combustion engine, most people buy a car. I'm sorry, most people buy a car. They don't buy an internal combustion engine. And when we get to fusion, moving from market push to market pull, and getting the public generally aware of fusion, they're going to want to know more about its social and an economic relevance.
Right.
So how do we get the general public, including students and teachers, to learn and understand fusion energy, not so much from the engineering perspective, but from the social and economic pros and cons?
So people undoubtedly are interested in the cost of fusion energy, and let's assume that fusion energy manifests itself in the form of electricity. They want to know whether they have to pay 1 cent per kilowatt hour, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, or 100 cents per kilowatt hour. So price is really important. And the fusion energy in the form of electricity cannot be made available in the range of 1 to 20 cents per kilowatt hours. It will not find public acceptance, and the public will look for alternatives. So that's one very important aspect. The other very important aspect is reliability. If you're a purchaser of electricity, you want to be sure that you can count on the electricity being available to you. for your personal use or in a hospital or in the company. And that has to be addressed. Then there is the really important issue of who are the men and women who will run these fusion plants. And as fusion plants become available, and as we talked a few minutes ago, if other sources of energy are being downsized or maybe even abandoned, how do we make the transition for people to go from one kind of industry, which may be the natural gas or coal industry, into the fusion industry? That's a really important consideration because nobody would like to lose his or her job. But I think the fusion energy sector provides opportunities of a really good working environment, really worthwhile type of work that people will enjoy doing. It's a very sophisticated type of work to be done, and you do it for a good cause, namely providing energy that is so essential for our style of life. In terms of younger people, they typically get excited. Many of them get excited by the science and the difficulties of it. But I also look for, and we in the Fusion Energy of Council of Canada, we place a lot of emphasis on prospective students in fields other than engineering and science, like in business. What are the business opportunities? What are the opportunities for chemists who want to use the energy? For metallurgists who might be interested in using electricity in order to make steel, which we talked about just a few moments ago. So fusion energy opens up enormous opportunities. I shouldn't overlook quantum computing and artificial intelligence, which is in the forefront of most of our minds right now. So fusion energy is a tremendous enabler for a better future in terms of making existing products, but also making entirely new products. It will enable us to make products that are very energy intensive, would be too expensive to make with oil and gas, for example, as their sources of energy. And therein, I think, lies a lot of excitement for all members of the public as they become exposed to it.
We haven't touched on one other dimension of energy and which is accessibility. When one thinks about economies, one appreciates most economies, almost all economies have access to energy. Much of the world today still is remote, even though we've had vast movements of urbanization. There are people living, whether they be indigenous or simply be in the vast rural areas of the world. Does fusion offer any potential? Is it going to be more accessible given that it's one of the sources of fuel is water? But do you want to comment at all about whether or not fusion has the potential to be more accessible to more of the world than what we have today?
I think it very clearly has the potential because the raw materials that you need for fusion, if you go with deuterium tritium fusion as the example, are deuterium and lithium in very small quantities. You're talking about 90 kilograms per year of deuterium and maybe 300 kilograms of lithium per year for a gigawatt plant that could supply up to 1 million people. So the transportation of the raw materials to the site is not a major issue. You don't need pipelines. You can, in fact, transport the raw materials by air at a reasonably justifiable cost if you wanted to do that. But that's not to say that the first fusion plants will be located in small communities and in remote communities. I think that's highly unlikely because of the expertise and highly skilled workforce that you do need. And that they are typically more available in urban centers But over time, that will change. And if you were to look at it from the perspective of a country, take a country like Bolivia, for example, if it were to invest in one or two fusion plants, it could satisfy the energy demand of the entire country. Uh, and that's remarkable. So countries that are energy poor and would find it very difficult to justify the ongoing expenditures associated, for example, with natural gas or with petroleum, if they don't have natural gas and petroleum in their own borders. That's where fusion energy can make a very, very big difference.
So this development is more than just engineering. It is recognizing that at some point in time the public is going to become aware and either be confused or fear or enthusiastic, which obviously those that are champions of fusion want to see a public that's enthusiastic. And so we're calling for public awareness campaigns that may play a role in helping build trust and enthusiasm for fusion. Is it a little bit early to be acquainting the public and developing that level of trust, or do we run the risk of them becoming fearful of something before they really even understand it?
I think we have to be careful about how we inform the public so the public is not misled. And I say to my colleagues in the Fusion Energy Council of Canada, we must be objective advocates of fusion energy, meaning we will present its strengths and we will present its challenges in a fair and balanced way, neither overstating or understating the strengths and the deficiencies. And how to do that is really quite difficult because we live, especially in North America, in an environment where advertising is very common. And if you look at the way people advertise and therefore promote a product, they only accentuate the positive parts. And it makes people feel hesitant, in some cases jaded, to the point where they don't believe what an advertisement says anymore. So I think we want to be really thoughtful and careful about how we present fusion energy. And I'm delighted that you're giving me the opportunity to speak about it in what I would call a balanced way. It has great potential. It takes a lot of work. There are some risks to deal with, but the rewards for society at large are great. And so I think if the public understands the balance, it's important. I think it's also very important that the public understands that people who are currently working in the energy industry and whose companies may be negatively impacted by the advent of fusion energy or solar energy or the other forms, that they're not left behind. And let me make one other comment which relates to Indigenous community. In Canada, we're very aware and we're really interested in involving Indigenous people in decision making, and that will certainly be the case as we locate fusion plants. What I would like to see and what I've advocated is the involvement of young members of Indigenous communities in educational programs that lead to middle and senior level jobs in the industry, so that we do not create fusion plants where in an area where there may be one or several Indigenous communities, and then the members of the Indigenous communities drive the trucks, staff the cafeteria, but are not the managers or the scientists or the engineers or the business people. And we fortunately have the opportunity and the time to educate or enable the education of Indigenous people with respect to fusion energy. And that's what I think we need to do. So I would like to see nothing better than a number of scholarships, for example, or bursaries for members of indigenous communities to become acquainted with fusion energy. And if we can do that, then we build the workforce of the future for that sector, but integrated with the needs of their communities.
So manpower preparation, marketing, we've talked about a number of the engineering challenges yet before us that relate to containment,
Yes.
the production of the fuel, the tritium, the deuterium. Um, what in the next 20 years, if we're seeing the commercialization of future energy becoming widely available by 2050, and that begins this new period, what societal changes, positive and negative? This is a very, very significant moment of being able to have a billion-year supply of energy accessible, assuming it's cost affordable. It seems to me the changes would be profound. Do you want to elaborate on that element of this?
Yes, I think the most direct positive impact will be on poorer members of society. If they have access to affordable, reliable energy, it will enable them to establish businesses, to grow their businesses. It will enable them to have computing power, which we touched on before. It will enable them to travel and for business or even for pleasure. So there's ample evidence to the effect that when energy becomes available at affordable and reliable prices, it can lift entire segments of society from a state of uh, poverty into what we often call the middle class, where they have access to facilities and amenities. And that's really very important to do. So I see it as an enabler in that respect for Canada. But if I look around the world, there are countries that are impoverished as countries and do not have access to affordable energy. If we can make that possible, then we will also improve the lives of people throughout the world. Today, we still have out of 7 billion people, of the order of 2 billion people who don't have access to electricity in any reliable way. And this is remarkable in the 21st century where we are, but we're only making slow progress, and fusion energy should provide one way of addressing that.
Well, this brings us to wrap up, Axel. You focused
Okay.
on the impact of fusion and how it may well aid the lives of individuals in the billions. And it would, I think it's not hard to say as well that it will enable nations today to become more self-sufficient in order to produce what their people need in order to stabilize and provide levels of sufficiency for those nations. So I want to thank you for your input through these two episodes. I'm sure we'll be meeting again and discussing this further, but particularly when we get to 2050, and we're both going to be reflecting on fusion at that time. So again, thank you very much for your input today.
Yeah, very welcome, and thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.